Welcome everyone. Today I have with me a true biohacker in the best sense of the word, Dave Feldman. Now Dave is a senior software engineer and business developer who went on a keto diet in 2015, and he saw his cholesterol numbers climb. So after some incredibly interesting self-experimentation and meticulous measurements that we need to get into today, Dave found some interesting patterns emerging that I found fascinating. I came across Dave's experiments from a talk he gave at a low-carb conference in Breckenridge, Colorado, and I'm privileged to have him here today. So welcome to the show, Dave.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So before we start discussing LDL and your outstanding research and the Feldman protocol, I want to tell you a short story. So I did my PhD studying various fats and LDL and cholesterol, like I was saying before the show. And actually my lab had developed this plaque model, artery plaque model, and we used rabbits like a lot of other people do, which is ironic because we fed these rabbits extremely high levels of cholesterol, and rabbits never eat cholesterol, right? They eat grass.
Yep.
And of course, we make all these conclusions from this rabbit model, but they don't even get plaques in their arteries feeding them cholesterol. You have to literally put a balloon catheter up their leg to get it up by their heart, open up this balloon, and basically move the balloon up and down to injure the walls of the arteries. And you still don't get enough plaque to cause a heart attack in these rabbits from that. So you literally have to inject them with a snake venom, which is called Russell's viper venom. And it gets worse because Russell's viper venom in humans actually thins the blood, but in rabbits it thickens the blood enough to cause a heart attack. So we've based a lot of scientific research and this plaque model on this rabbit model, which you can see is just almost hard to believe. And so, my first question for you is, if cholesterol is so dangerous in people, why is it in there? Why is it in our blood to begin with?
I'm so glad you're asking that. In fact, it really kind of brings me back to the very beginning of when I first got my cholesterol scores, and I needed to, in a hurry, learn everything that I could about the science. And of course, I had already gotten my core curriculum in college, so I'd already had some time with the biology. But I wasn't that interested in it then, and I certainly was interested in it now. Well, one of the more, again, kind of as an engineer, one of the more fascinating things to me is that there actually would be this mechanism in place that would slowly poison us over time. So why would our body put this dangerous substance in our bloodstream? Well, naturally, the first thing I learned about cholesterol is that it's used everywhere throughout the body. It's literally in every single cell we have. It's used in hormones, it's just all over the place. And our body actually seems very good about maintaining it in a good homeostasis. There's quite a lot that goes behind that. So why then would it be that some people would have higher levels of cholesterol and other people wouldn't, particularly when some people like myself go on a low-carb, high-fat diet? And more I started to realize that no, actually, there's some disconnects here with what science is telling us should be the case and what the actual outcome is. And at its most basic level, you can just look at the elderly population. If you want to talk about something that's clearly a risk factor, there is less and less people who actually are alive to see it in their 90s, right? So let me give you some simple examples. Waist to hip ratio. You don't see a lot of people who have a whole lot of adipose tissue making it into old age. Slowly, they start thinning off more and more. Hyperinsulinemia. Do you have a lot of insulin in your blood? Unfortunately, the more you have hyperinsulinemia, the more likely it is that you're going to die sooner. Blood pressure. No question. The higher your blood pressure, the further you go into age, the more, all of these things, they have a curve, right? And it's a mortality curve that you can then expect to see a connection to death, frankly. And therefore, I expected to see the same thing taking place with cholesterol, since and this is what I like about it from an engineering perspective, since things that are associated with limited elasticity, I know it's kind of a mouthful, it means that with each new unit of measurement, if it's limited elasticity, the likelihood that it pops, if you will, gets exponentially higher. And we just don't observe that in the elderly population. In fact, there are plenty of studies now that say higher cholesterol as you get older becomes more protective. Again, this doesn't make sense. It should be, if anything, progressively worse and worse if it's developing atherosclerosis over time.
So you started researching cholesterol for yourself and had some kind of doubts about the standard conventional model of cholesterol. But tell me kind of how you discovered your actual what I like to call, and what a lot of people are calling, the Feldman protocol now. Because
yes,
essentially the way I kind of tell people is you've essentially stumbled across, and when I say stumble, I mean you meticulously documented things that you were doing. It wasn't an accident.
Stumble.
But
yeah.
But you basically stumble across this way to hack your cholesterol levels when you go into the doctor.
That's right. Well, so going back to the very beginning, as I kept looking through cholesterol, I kept seeing a familiar pattern. And as a software developer, I stand by it to this day. The lipid system is very much like a network. So pretty quickly I realized that I could change my cholesterol numbers pretty rapidly by just changing my dietary energy, and in particular fat. So while on a low-carb, high-fat diet, all things being equal, the more dietary fat I would have, the lower my cholesterol, and vice versa. The lower my dietary fat, the higher my cholesterol, inside of a very short window of time, inside about 3 days, just before the cholesterol test is taken. So on my first public presentation of this data, which took place last year at the Keto seminar, I went ahead and arranged an extreme cholesterol drop experiment, where basically I first had around 750 calories a day, very low calorie ketogenic diet. Took my blood on the Friday before the presentation. My presentation was on the weekend, so that was October 7th. Then October 9th, I give the presentation, but in that whole weekend I was eating about 5,000 calories a day, and around 460 grams of fat a day, which, by the way, is really tough. It was really, and a lot of people who have done the protocol since can vouch for this. So I do that, and in my presentation I say you're witnessing a huge drop in my cholesterol, and how I'm doing it is I'm eating enormous amounts of fat. And I had a silhouette of myself which hadn't yet taken place for October 10th, which was the day after the presentation. And I said, I'm so confident that I will get my blood drawn tomorrow and that my LDL cholesterol will drop. I stake my reputation, all my research on it. And that's exactly what happened. The test that I was taken the day after, my LDL, I think, dropped 73 points. This was in 3 days. 73 points. My LDL-P, the particle count, dropped by 1,115. And it only proved how dynamic the lipid system is, and weirdly, how you wouldn't have expected this, that it's inverted. That again, the higher amount of fat it was, the lower it went. Well, sure enough, afterwards, lots of people were saying, Dave, this is exciting. I would like to do this. So I actually wrote up a page that I originally called the Extreme Cholesterol Drop Experiment. Typical engineer, it was nice and long, and I felt descriptive, even though I'd like it to have been more descriptive. And more people were like, could I just call it the Feldman protocol? And I was like, all right, fine, call it the Feldman protocol. And so since then, there have been a number of people, I've actually now lost count, unfortunately. It's something in the neighborhood of over 60 people have done a version of the Feldman protocol where they've eaten enormous amounts of fat. They've then had their test taken, and it's had about an 86% success ratio up to this point, which, by the way, matches the group experiment that we did about a month ago, I want to say, at Keto Fest.
I was going to say, I'd heard about that Keto Fest experiment.
Yeah, I was able to get 24 people to do it. Unfortunately, we had one person drop off. but 20 of the 23 people who gorged on fat all through the Keto Fest weekend, 20 of the 23 people saw their cholesterol drop by 5% to 38%. And even for those 3 that had it go up, it only went up by 1 or 2%. And those numbers are not made up numbers. Those are actually from PTS Diagnostics. We not only did it on their CardioCheck devices, but we sent off labs for 2 different lipid labs to carry the results back to us so that we could confirm this drop. And without question, we saw it across the board. There's a great graph that I'll eventually have up on the blog that shows it. I call it the tilted ladder, because you can see no matter where you started on one side, it just goes down for almost everybody.
And just so people know the genius of this protocol, I mean, it's already known that unless you have some rare mutation, LDL circulates in your body for about 2.5 days on average. So your protocol, just to maybe make it super simple for people to understand, is, you go into ketosis. Well, maybe I'll have you describe it, right? I mean, my understanding is you go into, the simple understanding of it is you're in ketosis, you eat real low calories for a couple days, and then you eat high calories for 3 days. And then you check your LDL on the 3rd or 4th day there, and it's going to be lower than ever.
There's basically 3 flavors, and they're all about the total time span and how many tests you do. So the first flavor is, hey, you just eat a lot of fat for 3 days. The second flavor is you eat low amount. You still stay ketogenic, but you have a low amount for a 3-day sprint, get your blood drawn, and then you have a high amount for a 3-day sprint and get your blood drawn. And that way you can see a little more of the gap in between. And then the last one is the 10-day protocol. Not a lot of people have done this one. Obviously, I've done it, but it's you do 3 days very low, you get a blood draw. You do another 2 days very low, get a blood draw, and then it's the reverse. You do 3 days very high, get a blood draw, and then 2 days very high and get a blood draw. And the reason for that is because the low-density lipoprotein particle count goes more on a 5-day window than a 3-day window. The low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, the cholesterol inside the lipoprotein, that appears to be going more on a 3-day window. And so I think maybe it'll help your viewers just a little bit to kind of break it out. The reason, the actual physiological reason, is your LDL particles in your body that are actually providing the energy for your cells, they really come in 2 varieties, and it kind of has to do with their origin point. So the first variety is from food you just ate. So if you just ate food that gets processed in the gut, that makes a kind of low-density lipoprotein called a chylomicron. They're huge, fat particles, and I like to call them the sprinters. The reason I do is because they go into your bloodstream and they drop off those triglycerides super fast. They're just like absolutely pot. It's getting around all over the place, and within minutes to hours at the most, they're cleared by the liver. They become tiny little chylomicron remnants because they've dropped off all their cargo, and then boom, they get absorbed, right? The other kind is known as a VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. That's how it originates. And those come not from the gut, they come from storage, specifically the liver. They're hepatic, right? And because they come from storage, my research is showing that they tend to compensate for the difference of the incoming chylomicrons. So if you're, to put it really simply, if you're in a state of abundance where you're eating a lot of food, lots of fat, etc., your body has a good reason to say, well, hey, there's no reason for me to upregulate the VLDLs because they come from stored fat, right? Yep. Therefore, the total amount of them is lower. However, if on the other side of it, you're in a state of scarcity, you're not eating a lot of fat, particularly if you're in a fasted state, your body's like, well, actually, we need to mobilize more of these LDL particles from fat. And therefore, it goes ahead and brings that up, right? There's more lipolysis.
I love that explanation. I think you do a really nice job simplifying it.
So the final linchpin is the cholesterol that you're getting in a blood test is not capturing chylomicrons because they've expired. They're capturing the ones you just mentioned, the ones that last for days, that originated from the liver, the VLDLs. Therefore, that's why the cholesterol seems to go down when you're eating more fat and seems to go up when you're not. It's because you're only capturing the one half of it that came from stored food.
So does flavor one of this protocol, the really simple flavor, right, where you just eat more for a couple days, do you see these same results in people that are not in ketosis, or is this a ketosis specific thing across the board?
I don't know that ketosis specifically matters. I know that the people who've done it have generally been fat adapted. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a requirement. It's been more just I'm featured a lot in the low carb community. I actually want people on a carb centric diet. In fact, I want people who are vegans, who are on a high carb diet. I want everybody to do this protocol.
I agree, yeah.
I would like to see how much this applies outside, and frankly, I kind of feel like it does. I don't have any physiological reason to believe that the science won't support it on the other side as well, but can only know once the experiments actually take place.
Yeah, it's powerful. I mean, honestly, most people like me and people like you, and most people that are nerds and people that are scientists and things, we're interested in this, from a really pure scientific perspective. But I think most people honestly are interested in this from a life insurance perspective.
Yeah.
And they're willing to go into ketosis or fat adapt, for a whole month and then start your protocol, in my opinion, just to get that one number low, just get that one measurement, not take the blood before, because I think the results are so robust that, it's becoming clear, at least in my mind, that you can use this to pick up that life insurance number, which shows you how silly the whole LDL thing is to begin with. And it's have you ever shown these findings to any prominent medical doctors or scientists in the field of lipidology?
Well, I'm kind of glad you brought that up because, it's a bit frustrating because I've actually reached out to many different conventional lipidologists. And I won't do any name dropping because I don't want to call them out per se. I can recognize the situation they're in that here's a guy who's kind of, from the internet and doesn't appear to be a doctor, doesn't appear to be a researcher, etc. However, there's been enough traction now with the research that I'm doing. There's been enough movement within the low carb community that at a minimum, I'd like to think that they would want to falsify this pattern. And I invite them to do that. Go ahead and do like a full scale, it doesn't even need to be a full scale study, even a pilot study, and find out for yourself. Find out if this inversion pattern continues to apply when done by people who are skeptical, provided that you're very transparent with the research. Because I'm willing to bet that they're already concerned that that may actually be the case, that this inversion pattern does apply outside of the low carb community as well. The reason this is such a factor is the very thing you brought about, which is things like life insurance. In fact, just this week, I had the 8th person who has confirmed to me that they got a better life insurance rate that's inside the low carb community.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
now,
good.
this is what's interesting is everybody who's done the life insurance hack, if you want to call it that, has been somebody who's on a ketogenic diet and does not want to leave it.
Wow. So they're probably healthier already.
But they know that their higher lipid numbers are going to impact their insurance, and they want to get a better insurance rate without having to say, okay, well now I got to take in a whole bunch of carbs, etc. But you may not have to be on a ketogenic diet to use the inversion pattern to get a better life insurance rate. You may actually be on a regular diet. You may even be on a standard American diet, and it may turn out to be true that you could have a large amount of fat and actually still bring down your LDL numbers. I would want you to get into a healthier diet first anyway, but still, it may be that this applies as well.
And when we talk about this being a healthier diet, I mean, you've checked, I know already, but just for the audience, you've checked your CRP levels and inflammation and some of these other markers that are a lot more relevant to health. What do you find when you do that?
Well, and let me qualify myself a little bit on that even more. I've had 75. I believe I'm at 75 now. Total blood draws since November of 2015, and half of those have not just a CRP. They have CMP, Comprehensive Metabolic Panel, a CBC, complete blood count, fasting insulin. Huge. I have something in the neighborhood of around 27, 28 markers that I track when I can, because I'm very curious about a lot of these numbers and how much they change or don't change. And yes, my inflammation numbers across the board are very low. And to go a step further, I've had a CAC twice. I've had a carotid into media thickness test, left and right side. And by the way, these have actually, the thickness has actually dropped since I started. I've had a total of 3 of the tests about every 6 months, and the lowest one that I had was this last one. Now, to be sure, there could be some margin of error. I don't know until I just get a lot of these. So over time, I'll find out. But the big kicker is arguably the most advanced non-invasive heart scan that exists is a 640 slice CT, and I flew to New York to get one.
Wow.
I went to North Shore University Hospital, had them do it. I was one of the only cases that ever did this because I wasn't already a heart risk of any kind that they were aware of. I'd already had a cardiologist do an echo and a stress test. I passed all of that with flying colors. So the fact that I was going only because I had high cholesterol and because I was doing it for research really kind of surprised the cardiologist there. But did the full-blown scan. Really, by the way, an amazing scan. It actually goes through my heart in several slices from several angles so that you can actually make a 3D model of my heart. As a geek, I love that, right? But you can literally see my my coronary artery system, right?
Yep.
And look right through the whole. And to be sure, again, I want to say this is as much for a baseline as a confirmation. But that said, if I've had hypercholesterolemia for 2 years, at the levels that I have it now, you would have expected some signal somewhere of some progressive plaque or some association with inflammation, because that, by the way, is also an explanation I'm sure you've heard several times, is now that they know inflammation can create atherosclerosis, they'll say the actual LDL cholesterol being high by itself creates the inflammation. I don't see that at all. Not at all with my own numbers.
Well, even the rabbit model, like I said, which is kind of the gold standard in animal models, that doesn't even show that. You don't get plaques. You give them a ton of cholesterol. It's not even natural for them to eat cholesterol.
Yep.
And you still don't get the plaques. And what's really funny, you mentioned hypercholesterolemia. Just for my listeners, what they teach us in medical schools and PhD, I'm a biochemist in the biochemistry classes. They teach you about a genetic mutation
called familial hypercholesterolemia. And what that is it's usually an LDL receptor mutation. Now, LDL is what people are calling cholesterol, and so this is floating around in your blood, and you've got these little receptors, LDL receptors, and they grab onto LDL and pull it out of your blood. We'll just make it that simple for now. And what happens if you get a mutation in that receptor, it doesn't pull the cholesterol out of your blood, or the LDL, more accurately, and what you find is incredibly high levels of cholesterol. And then if people get the slightest bit of inflammation, it causes plaques in your arteries. It even builds up around your eyes sometimes. It's called xanthomas. You see little bubbles of cholesterol. I mean, there's so much cholesterol in these people's bodies that you get heart attacks early. But here's the thing. They use that story and that example and kind of put it on a pedestal to say, look, cholesterol causes plaques. Cholesterol clogs your arteries because of this rare mutation. And they apply that to everybody. And really what it comes down to be really honest, is the drug companies making billions of dollars on statins have a huge influence on what is taught in medical schools and kind of the spin that they put on it. But because we're not really teaching diet, and in medical schools, even in the PhD classes, we're not even understanding the fundamentals of this stuff. Yeah, but that's the example people use, and I'm glad you brought up the hypercholesterolemia, because it's good for people to know that just because this rare example happens, it doesn't mean everybody gets plaque in their arteries from cholesterol.
No, I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because there was a recent paper that was put out that was just a gigantic meta-analysis, trying to really drive home that, hey, there's just this huge wealth of data that shows that high cholesterol is, they said, does it meet the requirements of being causal or something like that, as kind of to set it up as though there's anything other than cause that actually can be, associative enough that it can be causal. And sure enough, I went straight to the causal papers, and they, almost all of them, the first like 3 or 4, were cited familial hypercholesterolemia studies. And I just get so frustrated by this, because per what you're talking about, let's break down the term. Familial being genetic, hyper being high, cholesterol and emia being in the blood. That's actually almost like false advertising, because you could say, hey, cholesterol ends up being higher in the blood for somebody who has FH. But that's not actually an overproduction of cholesterol. What it is those receptors not being able to pull out the LDL particles as part of what may or may not be part of the cause of the disease. But comparing that population with a normal functioning receptor population that has high cholesterol, but for different reasons potentially, is crazy, because it's you're taking a genetic. This, by the way, you being a biochemist, you can appreciate this. They do the same thing with animal studies all the time. They get genetically modified animals. They believe that they've proven something by taking, like, say, knockout mice, which have
knockouts,
they straight up make sure they have no LDL receptors at all. And then they go, oh, look, there's deleterious effects that happen when they have high levels of cholesterol. Well, of course, they have a mutation associated with being able to handle those lipoproteins. And lo and behold, there's problems with them. No, take like a normal population of mice. You know what? I've actually proposed this several times. I've said, look, get a nice, large variety of a single species, so a large genetic variety. Please don't have a whole bunch of mice or rabbits that are related to each other, because that also brings up a whole bunch of other issues, right? Get a nice, wide variety, put them on a low-carb, high-fat diet. And then you know what? If you see that species, if you see clusters of that species that actually developed hyper-responder levels, where they actually had high cholesterol all on their own, and they died off sooner, you'd have more of a valid case to be made against the low-carb, high-fat diet and lifestyle than anything else. Even though it would be an animal model, you could at least actually go into their arteries to find it out. I think that they know this, and I think that they don't have an interest in making that happen. I think that they like the genetically modified animal experiments, because you can actually seek out the results you want to get.
Yeah, it's frustrating, and there's so many problems with the mouse model to begin with, in terms of how their physiology handles cholesterol.
Yes.
It's so different from humans.
Well, and let me actually tell you where my research may really be a problem for animal studies, and in particular rodent studies, is I only just recently found out that they don't have the added value of C-reactive protein usage like we do.
Yep.
And that actually fasted rodent studies don't seem to see the same spike in cholesterol that fasted humans do, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's a huge deal if it turns out that the inversion pattern that's a part of my research is applying just to us and not to them. I can't emphasize enough how that changes everything, because that then suggests that their lipid system is not as dynamic and would therefore not be as relevant for the outcome of where it is that we may in fact be upregulating LDL particles in response to various things, such as an infectious event, which we already know is the case, right? You actually are making use of the LDL particles to bind to pathogens to clear from your bloodstream. Well, that's obviously a big deal, in that it shows just how much we're already making use within our bodies to create this homeostasis in the first place.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I think there's a lot of aspects. I'm definitely going to write about that in my book, in terms of the differences between the animal models and the human studies, and how much discrepancy that's caused, and how much vested interest there is. And there's a lot of conformational bias within science. I have an example where I went to a talk by a famous scientist, and he was talking about trans fats and how bad those are for people. But when he first came up with that research and started presenting it, I mean, it's just data, right? It's not his emotional, it's not his, like his feelings about something. It was his data, and people were literally laughing at him on stage. He's presenting this at scientific conferences, and now, of course, we all know that trans fats are unhealthy. But when he first was presenting that, there was such it's a culture of kind of I don't know what the word is, like groupthink.
Oh yeah.
Where you have to fight that initially, and I think, I know you're looking for scientists to publish some of this, and I'm doing a fellowship at the Mayo Clinic in about a month. I'm going to start that, so hopefully we can put something together here and actually publish this with the Mayo Clinic under my name. I can pull some of the research together, and I've got a guy at Duke University who can do biostatistics, a good friend of mine. He can do the stats for us and tighten it up. I don't do biostats. I always hire that out. But I think this would be an awesome paper, and it would really be disruptive, and it would also kind of lead to a lot of other papers.
Well, and let me emphasize something. I'm not ultimately in this for pushing any particular agenda beyond getting this to being transparent, right? As it happens, I actually have a write-up for what I want to be my first formal study, so I may actually just send that your way. But I already hear that it's already a bit obtrusive compared to what normally happens for like a pilot study, because I want it to be a ward study. But I think you may actually commiserate with me on this, in that I don't already like nutrition studies as they are, because I don't feel they're very good about controlling for the many other variables that you should be controlling for. So yeah, I would like my participants to be sequestered. I would like to provide the food that they're going to eat for it, so that I can be sure of its composition. And I'd like to record every single thing that there is for it, so it could be independently auditable. And unfortunately, just those three things alone I see in almost no studies. And I feel like before there would be less of a reason to do it, because things like, say, recording your subjects having their food and being sure that all of that data gets collected would have required more expensive equipment. In today's day and age, it's all cheap and should be easily done. And it's honestly, I wish it was just a requirement. I wish that there was the means by which every study got archived and could ultimately then be reviewed, not just by the peers that may be like-minded, but by the general public, if it's actually a study that's very impactful, as it should be, because I feel like science should be more transparent, particularly in the area of nutrition.
Yeah, it's unbelievable some of the lack of precision within especially nutrition science. And I've been to talks, by people that are getting their PhDs in nutrition, and I'm always kind of appalled by how loose they are with their controls and all of these kinds of things that you're talking about. And honestly, it's almost worse than not doing the study, because when you do sloppy studies like that, it leads to misleading information, and it actually just causes more confusion for the rest of the people. So you'd rather have fewer studies.
Couldn't agree more.
The problem I think today is so many people are doing their PhDs and their postdocs and all this, and they feel pressured to get papers out. And even though the papers are really low quality, they just keep pumping them out, and that causes a lot of confusion. It's difficult to sift through all this stuff.
Now, let's place the emphasis where it's due, which is in the publications themselves. If a journal feels it's acceptable to take something that's very sloppy and feel like that's appropriate enough for the culture of that sphere, then they're not pushing up the standards of that industry. And unfortunately, that's why most of the nutrition studies people put in front of me, or they'll say, hey, have you heard of this one or that one? I'll oftentimes read a ways into it until I've seen something that I feel makes it basically useless to me. And so let me give you an example, and not to pick on one, but like the Nusi study, right, with Kevin Hall. The very initial pilot study, where I barely got to the graph itself. It showed the graph. It showed that it was heading downward, and then you saw the little curvature where where the subjects went on the low carb, high fat, right?
Yep.
Immediately, I was like, well, wait a sec, they're not even energy stable to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
They're already losing weight on what's supposed to be the isocaloric level. So it would be like if I said, hey, I want to measure the torque of your car. Well, let's go ahead and start it going downhill first. You would correctly say, well, I mean, maybe there's some useful data here, but it's not as useful as if we just go ahead and started it at a standstill, right?
Yeah.
That's a very relevant factor to the diet itself. And I mean, this is a study with tons of money behind it. Very small number of subjects. Why not at least get them to a point at which they were at least weight stable at whatever diet you turned it into? Because, to give you another example, okay, maybe that carb-centric diet that they had that they were going to then shift from was still lower carbs than what they were originally eating, and that's why they were losing weight going into that diet, right? I mean, just the mere fact that that's even a possibility is already too much of a confounder for me to even want to, get any further into the study. And that's how it is with most studies, both pro-low carb and anti-low carb, right? It's a serious issue.
Well, you're making a good argument for using animal studies. And that's one of the reasons they do. The problem is there's so many conflicting factors in terms of this particular situation. And this is true of Alzheimer's disease too, and a lot of other areas where mice don't get Alzheimer's, so they have to make these crazy manipulations. And then the models don't really mean anything in most cases. But what about, you're talking about variables and controlling variables. What about exercise, and especially, let's start with maybe distance running. Have you tested any endurance exercise, and how has that impacted your LDL?
Indeed, I have. In fact, I don't know that any of the presentations, because I have done presentations on it, but I don't know that any of them have aired yet, I guess you could say. Oh, you know what? Actually, just this week, one did, which was from the Low Carb USA presentation I did. So the data that I have done most of my presentations on goes until August of last year, and that's because during that period of time I had not done any distance running on purpose. I anticipated that it would impact my lipid numbers. And I was right, because from August of last year until January this year, I did a huge number of different half marathons and finished with a full marathon. And over the course of that period of time, obviously I was doing a lot of training as well. Sure enough, over that period of time where the exercise started taking place, my LDL-C and my LDL-P did drop by a margin. Not a huge margin, relatively, except for two particular points in time. The very beginning of my training, where I did a cold open, as in I was supposed to be training for 3 months, but instead, due to my experiments, I started at the 6-week point. So when I say cold open, I mean I was doing a 7-mile run on my first week of training.
Wow.
And I got a test 2 days after that, and sure enough, my LDL-C had dropped by a lot in the gap, showing what I had speculated on this whole time, which is the reason the lipid numbers get impacted is not just because of energy changes, but also because there's something called, you're probably familiar with this, something called receptor-mediated endocytosis.
Yep.
That is happening all the time at your liver, pulling in your LDL particles. But you know what? Your non-liver tissues, when they need repair, they pull in LDL particles because they're made of the stuff that are the building blocks of cells, phospholipids and cholesterol. So I've always anticipated, and the research kind of backs this up, that one good way, for example, for you to drop your cholesterol, if that's all you care about, is to do a lot of resistance training. Tear up your muscles like crazy, right? In a good way. And you'll probably absorb a lot of LDL particles out of your system. That's what they're there for, right? Well, sure enough, my cold open, I had the biggest gap in my inversion pattern relative to where it should have been. And the very last full marathon, where I also had done a 5K and a 10K in the week before. So muscle repair absolutely correlated with a drop in the LDL-C, which again shows just how dynamic this system is. But I'll go one step further, which is the 3 lowest triglyceride scores that I've had. All of them were 24 hours after a half marathon, and the full marathon. Which is exactly what I expected, because again, the triglycerides are the energy, and my LDL particles were getting depleted of their energy to top those cells back off again. After all, I don't have a ton of glycogen stores that I went through. I had a lot of fat that I went through. So my cells were then repleting, were replenishing themselves from the fat that was coming from my LDL particles.
I bet there's some interplay there with the chylomicrons too. I bet there's more gut uptake of fat and chylomicron transport when you're exercising, because your body is probably signaling for that as a necessity.
There's actually a lot of science that kind of backs that up as well. And I believe that this all kind of ties back to why a low-carb, high-fat diet has more of what I call an effective disposal method. It seems to be a lot of people, myself included, could ramp up the calories like crazy. It's hard, but when we ramp it up, we don't gain weight to the same degree that we would with a carb-centric diet. And I believe that a lot of it's because, and I'm not yet into all the mechanisms of it, I believe that there's more pushback into how much is going to get absorbed at the gut level, because the body's much more aware of its energy status and has just more control of that in a fat-based diet than it does in a carb-based diet.
So somebody on Facebook, Mary Voda, asked me to ask you, can HDL be too high? And essentially, what happens to your HDL in these experiments? We haven't covered that.
Actually, HDL typically goes up. It's not as correlative as LDL-C, but I want to say it's if I were to give it a guesstimate, I would say there's a good 75% chance your HDL will go higher. But again, I don't put a lot of stock in that being a positive outcome. I believe it's just part of the dynamics of it. Now, as far as just in general, can your HDL be too high? The short, qualified answer is I don't know, but I doubt it. HDL is actually the marker I most care about, particularly when people are bringing me their labs, in that I've seen so many things that link having high HDL to having positive outcomes. Not because I believe just the sheer production of the HDL matters. It's because I believe it's reflective of the status of your vascular system. So the analogy I like to use is cops in the neighborhood. If you've got cops that are patrolling your neighborhood a lot, you're feeling good because you're not seeing them stopped on the side of the road. You see that they're loose, they're patrolling, and that's basically what HDL is. They're the emergency vehicles of your vascular system, right? If there's anything that's pulling cholesterol out of your arteries, in fact, it's only one thing. It's HDL, through reverse cholesterol transport. Well, what if all of a sudden the cops just disappeared from your neighborhood? You had no idea where they went. Well, a natural assumption is, darn it, they may have been pulled in as reinforcements to some major trouble, some hotspot downtown or something, right? That's what I believe is ultimately going to get shown more and more as we get deeper into the ability to see the actual HDL engagement in the vascular system, that they're not getting picked up in a blood test because they're busy, and busy in a bad way.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing before we go, we should mention statins, because a lot of people are going to have that on their mind, and they're going to say, well, what about statins? And isn't there some big positive benefit people see from statins? And so I guess the question for you would be, do you see a health benefit from statins, or do you just see an LDL lowering effect from statins, which are two different things, which can be two different things? And then, what kind of impact would statins have on your health in different situations, maybe? But let's start with, do statins actually lower your LDL, and do statins actually increase your health? Do you have any experience on the research there?
So short version is, do statins lower your LDL? And I give a big thumbs up. If you're into lowering your LDL, statins are a great way to do that. But as I like to joke, that's because they're so effective at lowering your LDL, there's actually been no thing that has given me more doubt in the lipid hypothesis than statins.
Yeah.
My favorite analogy is if you're in a town that's got 10,000 cars on the road and you have 104 accidents a day, and then I, as the mayor, am like, there's just too many cars on the road, and I get it down to 5,000 cars on the road. And the city manager comes back to me and goes, good news, the total accidents dropped from 104 to 103. You probably know why I'm picking on the number 104, because that's the NNT as a number needed to treat for a statin to have a benefit on events, not even on mortality, but on total events. So I would expect, mechanistically, if you brought down the total number of elements that they're identifying that they want to decrease, which in this case is the milligrams per deciliter of LDL-C, and of course it also has impacts on LDL-P, I would expect a huge benefit in cardiovascular outcomes, right?
Yep.
So even for the amount with which people point out to it, and to be sure, I'm talking mainly in primary prevention, which is to say you haven't yet had a heart attack. I've seen so little of such little margins that I question how much I can even trust the science as it stands. I already know how much they, like the studies of Mr. Fit, the shenanigans with Jupiter. These different studies, they have things that I really, really disliked, in that they put so much effort into trying to really extrapolate very tiny margins that I myself have a problem with trusting that they have strong positive outcomes. Now, a lot of people will say, because statins do have anti-inflammatory properties, that may in itself be a benefit, even if it's not about lowering the LDL cholesterol. And that may be the case. Secondly, I would say that the secondary prevention is just something I'm not as versed in, and it may be that there's a benefit to that. But once again, that's just not an area in which I have as much expertise on.
Yeah, and one area I'm focusing in my book is just the amount of cholesterol we have in our brain, and the importance of just brain function, proper brain function and optimization. It's unbelievable. You start taking statins, especially the ones that get into your brain. And the kind of another irony here is my PhD advisor, of course, again, rabbit models, all this extrapolation of data, putting, balloons up into these arteries of rabbits, injecting them with snake venom and making these claims that it's all about the cholesterol. But he was on statins, and he should know better, but honestly, there's such a culture of this. He was on statins. He was bragging to me one day that the ones that he takes are the kind that cross your blood-brain barrier, because he wants lower cholesterol in his brain, which just shows you how limited the education is in terms of nutrition.
Hard to believe. And by the way, since you brought it up, because I try to bring this up, the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis has never been shown to be strictly LDL cholesterol. It's still a theory. It has not yet been positively proven while controlling for inflammation, oxidative stress, and endothelial damage. Once they have a study that can control for those three, it'll be fine. But getting to that last one, getting to endothelial damage, going up with a balloon catheter into the carotid artery and denuding it, right? The thing you're talking about where you're expanding it, you are intentionally damaging those cells that line your vascular wall, known as the endothelial cells, right? And we do have plenty of studies that show endothelial damage and dysfunction is causatively atherosclerotic. Causatively. I can give you, if this were a horror movie and I strapped you down, I was like, I'm going to give you atherosclerosis. That would be the one way I would know to do it, right?
Yep.
So until you actually can control for that, you can say, look, the things in the subject that would give it endothelial damage, we know we've controlled for, or we've at least made sure that they're in equal levels of degree as to our control group, right?
Yep.
You cannot make the claim that there's this other thing outside of that is in fact the causative agent. You can't do it. So unfortunately, every single day the actual cause of atherosclerosis that I'm actually concerned about me personally is damage to my endothelial layer. So I care about my endothelial health much more than I care about my lipids.
Yeah, yeah. And that's sometimes where you see these really extreme endurance runners or whatever, getting some heart, increasing some heart problems and things. And yeah, I agree 100%. And it's kind of almost like saying your calcium causes plaques in your arteries or something to say LDL causes plaques in your arteries, because we can do calcium CT scans and find calcium in the plaques. I mean, it doesn't, correlation and cause, it always goes back to that. But how do people, just to wrap it up, how do people get, find you and contact you and, continue doing your awesome work?
Well, sure. Of course, my blog is cholesterolcode.com. And you can also reach me on Twitter. It's just Dave Keto, as in DaveKeto. And without question, I'm very appreciative of everybody. One way to always support is to try this yourself. Help us prove how dynamic the cholesterol is in your system by trying some version of the protocol. If you're able to take these steps yourself, a lot of people do it just out of curiosity. A lot of people have done it because they've straight up told me they just want to get their doctor off their back.
Yep.
And so coming up to the test that they do it, they go ahead and then do some version of the protocol there. But all in all, the biggest thing that I really care about, that I really want to get across, is that, in my opinion, given everything I know and given all of the research up to this point, making a lifelong medical decision based on a single annual cholesterol test to me just seems insane. And I'd caution anybody from making that decision to at least look through some of this research and make the decision for yourself as to whether you feel that that's appropriate to actually go for the rest of your life on a medication based on a test that you're going to hopefully find out is extremely dynamic and truly just based almost 30 to 50% on the food you just ate in the last 3 days.
Yeah. Wow. I agree, and I encourage everyone to get in touch with Dave and get involved and help out with this. I know I'm going to try, and it might be a year or two before you actually see professional publications on this, but hopefully we can do it through the Mayo Clinic.
Sure.
And I appreciate your time today, Dave. Thanks.
Thank you.